The first time Elias noticed the room had changed, he dismissed it without effort. He had stepped into it dozens of times before, always with the same quiet expectation. The spare room at the end of the hallway had once been his study, then a storage space, then nothing in particular. It existed without demand. That was why he liked it. No windows, no noise, just a square room with pale walls and a faint smell of dust. That morning, when he crossed the threshold, he felt it before he saw it. A slight resistance in the air, like stepping into a space already occupied by breath. He stopped. The walls seemed closer. Not dramatically, not enough to startle him, just close enough to make him adjust his stance, as though he had misjudged the doorway by an inch. Elias frowned, scanned the room, and took another step inside. The desk was still there. The chair, the box of old notebooks stacked neatly in the corner. Nothing was missing. Nothing had shifted. "You're tired," he said aloud, more to hear a voice than to correct a thought. He had slept poorly the night before. A series of half-dreams, all unfinished. He turned around, left the room, and shut the door behind him. The hallway felt normal again. Wide. Familiar. By evening, the moment had already begun to thin in his memory. He could recall the idea of it, but not the feeling. Like trying to remember the weight of a thought you once carried seriously. That night, he dreamed of standing in a place without edges. The second time, he measured. He brought a tape measure from the kitchen drawer, the kind with worn numbers and a bent metal edge. He stood in the doorway and hesitated, aware of a small reluctance he did not want to examine. The door opened without resistance. The room greeted him with the same quiet stillness, but now the difference announced itself more clearly. The walls were closer by enough that the air felt heavier, compressed. Elias swallowed. He measured the width, the length, the height. The numbers did not match his memory. That alone meant nothing. Memory drifted. Measurements changed based on angles, posture, error. So he measured again, and again. Each time, the tape pulled taut sooner than it should have. He checked the hallway, measured that too. Everything else remained obedient to expectation. Only the room resisted. Elias wrote the numbers down in a notebook and closed it carefully, as if sound might disturb the space. That evening, he searched online for explanations. Settling foundations, warped walls, structural creep, old houses shifted. That was known. That was reasonable. Still, when he lay in bed, he kept imagining the room breathing inward when no one was looking. The third time, he delayed. Days passed. He avoided the end of the hallway without admitting that he was doing so. He worked in the living room instead, then the kitchen, then anywhere else that allowed him to keep the door closed. But avoidance sharpened the thought rather than dulling it. On the fifth day, he opened the door again. The room was smaller. There was no mistaking it now. The desk nearly touched the far wall. The chair had to be angled to fit. The box of old notebooks pressed into the corner with a faint buckle along one side. Elias stood frozen in the doorway, heart tapping an uneven rhythm against his ribs. "This isn't possible," he said. The words sounded thin. He stepped inside and felt the walls respond. Not move, not visibly, but acknowledge him, like a held breath tightening. He backed out and shut the door with more force than necessary. That night, he did not dream. Elias told no one. There was no language for the problem that would not reduce it to absurdity. A shrinking room, a private impossibility, something that only existed because he was the one noticing it. Instead, he began documenting dates, measurements, sensations, emotional states. He wrote with careful neutrality, as though his restraint could anchor reality. Entry after entry followed the same pattern. Each visit, smaller. Each visit, more difficult to stay. The air inside grew warmer. Sounds dulled, as if absorbed before they could echo. His own breathing felt too loud. One afternoon, he noticed something else. The ceiling was lower. He tilted his head and felt a tightness in his neck. He was not tall, but now he could imagine brushing the surface if he stood straight. He left immediately, pulse racing. That night, he dreamed of pressing himself into a space not meant to hold him. The fourth visit came by accident. He had been searching for a file he was sure he had stored in the room years ago. The thought arrived uninvited, and before caution could intervene, he was standing in front of the door. His hand rested on the knob longer than necessary. When he entered, the room seemed to recoil. The walls were close enough now that he could stretch both arms and nearly touch them at the same time. The desk was useless. The chair could not be pulled out fully. Elias stood in the center, chest tightening, aware of the way his presence filled the space too completely. Something about the room felt aware. Not alive, not sentient, but responsive, as if it had learned him. A quiet pressure gathered behind his eyes. He stepped back, but the doorway felt narrower than before. He turned sideways to leave, brushing the frame. The contact sent a jolt through him. He exited quickly and leaned against the hallway wall, breathing hard. His palms were damp. He closed the door with shaking hands and slid down to the floor. That was the moment fear arrived fully formed, without disguise. He tried to measure again the next morning. The tape measure would not extend properly. It caught, jammed, and snapped back against his fingers. Frustration flared, sharp and misplaced. "Stop," he said, to the room or to himself. The word hung in the air, unanswered. He noticed then that the door did not open as wide as it once had. The hinge angle seemed reduced, as though the room itself resisted exposure. Inside, the walls felt closer still. The ceiling loomed low enough to force him to bend slightly. Elias felt a sudden, irrational certainty. The room was not simply shrinking. It was narrowing around him. He stepped back out and shut the door, heart pounding. The hallway stretched long and safe before him, but its familiarity no longer soothed him. He could not stop imagining the room compressing further, practicing without him there. Waiting. That evening, Elias moved the box of notebooks into the hallway. The effort felt necessary, though he could not articulate why. He did not like the thought of anything else being inside the room with whatever was happening. As he carried the box out, the room seemed to resist its removal. The space around it tightened, forcing him to angle the box just to free it. Once empty, the room looked smaller still. Bare walls, no furniture, no objects to distract the eye, just a closing shape. Elias stood at the threshold, unwilling to enter. The room did not invite him. It did not need to. He locked the door that night. It did not help. From his bed, he imagined the room continuing its work. Walls inching closer, ceiling lowering, a space learning exactly how much of him it required. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, he dreamed of standing upright in a place that no longer allowed standing. Elias woke before dawn with the sense that something had shifted while he slept. The house was quiet, but not empty in the way it should have been. The silence felt crowded, pressed together, as though space itself had tightened overnight. He lay still, counting breaths, waiting for the feeling to pass. It did not. He got up and stood in the hallway. The door at the end looked unchanged, yet it drew his attention with a quiet insistence. The lock he had turned the night before remained in place. The handle did not move when he tested it. That should have reassured him. Instead, unease deepened. He pressed his palm against the door. It felt warmer than the surrounding wall. Elias pulled his hand back. For the first time, he wondered if the room noticed his absence. He tried to ignore it. Days passed in a careful pattern. He stayed out of the hallway. He worked longer hours. He filled his evenings with noise, with television and music and unnecessary calls. Anything to drown out the awareness of the space he refused to enter. Yet the house itself began to feel altered. Hallways seemed shorter. Corners arrived sooner than expected. The distance between rooms felt unreliable, as though the layout rearranged itself when he was not paying attention. Elias measured again. Everything else remained correct. Only the room at the end of the hallway defied expectation, even when sealed. At night, he dreamed of standing outside a door that opened inward forever. On the seventh day, the lock failed. He noticed it in the afternoon, returning from the kitchen with a glass of water. The door stood slightly ajar, just enough to be noticeable. Elias froze, heart pounding. He was certain he had locked it. Certain. He approached slowly, each step deliberate. The air near the doorway felt dense, resistant, like humidity before a storm. He pushed the door open. The room inside was almost unrecognizable. What had once been a spare room was now closer to a vertical shaft. The walls pressed inward aggressively. The ceiling hovered just above eye level. The floor area barely allowed 2 feet side by side. It was no longer a room meant to be entered. It was a space meant to contain. Elias stood rooted to the threshold, panic crawling up his spine. He whispered. I didn't come in. The room offered no response, but it felt prepared. He stepped back and shut the door with shaking hands, then dragged a chair from the dining table and wedged it under the handle. The effort felt childish and necessary at the same time. That night, he slept in the living room with the lights on. Sometime near morning, he heard a sound from the hallway. A faint scrape. Slow, deliberate. He held his breath, listening. The sound stopped. Elias did not move until the sun came up. By the 9th day, the house itself felt hostile. Not aggressive, not threatening, just increasingly incompatible with him. Doorways felt lower. Furniture crowded his movements. Even open spaces carried a sense of narrowing, as though the house were learning how much room he required and adjusting accordingly. Elias stopped inviting anyone over. He stopped answering calls. The world beyond the house felt distant and irrelevant. Everything important had condensed into the shape of the hallway and the door at its end. He began to suspect the room was not shrinking. It was refining. On the 10th day, the chair fell. He heard it from the kitchen, a dull thump followed by silence. Elias stood frozen, water running unattended into the sink. When he reached the hallway, the chair lay on its side. The door stood wide open. The room inside was no longer a room. It was a narrow, vertical space, barely wider than his shoulders. The walls were close enough to brush both arms at once. The ceiling forced a slight hunch even at the entrance. The air inside felt warm and stale, heavy with the scent of skin and dust. Elias felt an overwhelming certainty. If he entered now, there would be no room left for hesitation. He backed away slowly and retreated to the living room. For the rest of the day, he sat on the couch, eyes fixed on the hallway, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did, and that frightened him more than movement would have. That night, the dreams returned. He dreamed he was standing upright, unable to bend his arms. The walls pressed against him from all sides. There was no pain, only pressure. A steady, patient pressure that suggested time itself was part of the mechanism. When he woke, his muscles ached as if he had truly been held in place. Elias made a decision before fear could soften it. He would enter the room one last time. He prepared carefully. He dressed in thin clothing. He left his phone on the kitchen table. He wrote a short note and placed it beside the sink, though he could not think who might read it. The hallway felt shorter than ever as he approached. The room waited with its door open. Elias stood at the threshold and hesitated. The space inside seemed to recognize him immediately. The air tightened. The walls felt closer, eager, almost anticipatory. He took a breath and stepped inside. The moment his foot crossed fully into the room, the space responded. The walls pressed inward with a subtle shift, closing the gap behind him. The doorway narrowed, then vanished altogether. Elias gasped and tried to turn, but there was no room to move. His shoulders brushed both walls. His chest pressed forward, breath shallow and forced. The ceiling lowered slightly, compelling him to bend. Panic surged, sharp and overwhelming. "This isn't how rooms work," he said, voice strained. The sound barely traveled. The pressure increased, not suddenly, but steadily, as though the room were finishing a long calculation. Elias felt the walls mold around him, adjusting to the exact shape of his body. There was no pain yet, only an intimate closeness that robbed him of space to think. He realized then what the room had been doing all along. It was not shrinking randomly. It was learning him. Time lost meaning. The pressure continued in small increments. His breathing became shallow, measured. Every movement felt expensive. Elias tried to remember the hallway, the width of the house, the idea of distance. Those memories felt abstract, like stories he had once heard. The room pressed closer. His thoughts slowed. There was a moment, brief and strangely calm, when the pressure stopped increasing. The space held him perfectly. He fit. When the room released him, it did so quietly. The door reappeared hours later, opening onto a hallway that looked unchanged. The house stood empty. Days passed before anyone noticed. A neighbor reported an odor. Authorities entered the house and found nothing unusual. No signs of struggle, no damage. At the end of the hallway, they found a narrow room. Perfectly square, perfectly ordinary, too small to hold much of anything. They measured it, documented it, and moved on. The house was sold months later. The new owner converted the spare room into a closet. They never noticed anything strange, except that it always felt just a little too full when they stepped inside.